The morning sun had just begun to push through the pine trees, casting long golden shadows across the pasture, when Marcus stepped out onto his porch with a cup of coffee in hand and the tension of enjoying the kind of peace only his ranch could provide. The horses were grazing lazily near the fence line, their tails swishing at flies, and the air was filled with that earthy scent of dew-soaked grass mixed with hay. For Marcus, mornings like this were the reason he'd bought the land in the first place. After years of city noise and suffocating neighbors stacked too close for comfort, the ranch was a sanctuary, a place where he could breathe deeply and move at his own pace. But as he walked down the gravel drive toward the gate to retrieve the newspaper, his eyes caught on something that didn't belong. A stark white envelope, fluttering slightly in the breeze, nailed right into the old cedar post. He frowned, set his coffee on the fence rail, and pulled it free. The paper inside was crisp, the HOA logo stamped at the top, and the bold letters at the heading made his stomach tighten. 72-hour notice to vacate and sell. He read it once, then again, disbelieving the audacity of the words. According to the letter, his property was in flagrant violation of community aesthetic standards and posed a blight on the neighborhood's carefully curated image. The board demanded that he either bring the property into compliance, which, by their definition, meant tearing down his rustic barn, repainting his weathered fence, ceasing agricultural operations, or else sell the land outright. Within 3 days, the language was cold, clinical, and insulting. Dripping with the arrogance of people who had never mucked a stall or built a fence with their own 2 hands, Marcus felt the anger stir low in his chest. Not a quick flare of temper, but a slow, steady burn, the kind that settled deep into the bones. He had known from the start that some of the HOA board members didn't like him. And not because of his horses, his tractors, or even his independence. No, he had seen it in the way they glanced at him during those first community barbecues, the stiff politeness that never softened into real warmth. He was the only black man on the edge of their pristine subdivision, the only one whose property didn't fit their cookie-cutter mold, and though they had never said it outright, the message was always clear. He didn't belong. At first, he had brushed it off, telling himself it was just ignorance, maybe even jealousy, but over time the pattern became impossible to ignore. The complaints about the smell of livestock, the side comments about how his barn ruined, the view, the HOA fines for trivial nonsense like the angle of his mailbox, it all built toward this moment. This letter that dripped with false authority. He leaned against the gate, the paper crumpling slightly in his fist, and stared out at the land he had worked so hard to own. This ranch wasn't just property. It was the culmination of years of sweat, savings, and stubborn willpower. He'd fought for this place, poured himself into it, built it up from raw dirt and weeds into something alive. And now, a group of suburban bureaucrats thought they could erase it all with a notice and a deadline. The absurdity of it made him laugh, a short, bitter chuckle that startled the horses into flicking their ears toward him. Did they really think he'd pack up and leave in 72 hours? Because a handful of neighbors with fragile sensibilities didn't like the view from their vinyl-fenced lawns? He folded the letter, shoved it into his pocket, and picked up his coffee again, his mind already moving past anger and into calculation. Because what the HOA didn't know what they couldn't possibly have understood when they drafted their smug little notice was that Marcus wasn't just some stubborn rancher on the fringe of their neighborhood. He was also the man who owned the ground their subdivision quite literally stood on. Years ago, before the HOA even existed, Marcus had purchased the bulk of the land in the area from a retiring farmer. The developers who had built the subdivision had leased the parcels from him under contracts that allowed families to build their neat little houses on his acreage. To the outside world, it looked like Marcus lived next to the subdivision. In reality, the subdivision lived on Marcus's land. He had chosen to keep his ranch intact while leasing the adjacent lots because he believed in balance. Let them have their cul-de-sac dreams. And he would keep his open pasture. It seemed like a win-win arrangement at the time, but now, holding that letter, he realized the irony. The HOA board, puffed up with self-importance, had given a man 72 hours to leave land that had been his before their neighborhood even existed. He shook his head slowly, sipping his coffee and felt the anger give way to something else entirely: resolve. They had picked the wrong man to bully, and the wrong battlefield to fight on. Imagine the looks on their faces when they realized the weight of the mistake they'd made, how their smug smiles would falter when the truth hit them like a hammer. Marcus wasn't just going to ignore their notice. He was going to turn it into the very tool of their undoing. He straightened from the gate, tucked the letter carefully into his shirt pocket, and began walking back up the gravel drive, his boots crunching with steady determination. The sun was higher now, casting the ranch in a glow that felt less like morning light and more like a spotlight on a stage. For the first time since he bought the land, Marcus felt the full force of the power he held, not just the pride of ownership, but the quiet, unshakable leverage of a man who knew the ground beneath everyone else's feet was his. The HOA thought they had cornered him with a deadline. They had only succeeded in writing their own. Marcus didn't waste time stewing over the insult. He was a man of action, and by the time he reached his porch steps again, the plan was already forming in his head with the sharp clarity of a storm cloud rolling over clear skies. The HOA wanted to play hardball, to push him into a corner with threats and deadlines. But what they had failed to realize was that they weren't the ones holding the bat, he was. That night, after dinner, with the letter pinned to the refrigerator, like a dare, Marcus pulled out the thick folder he kept locked in his desk drawer, the one with every lease agreement, contract. Indeed, carefully organized and annotated. He had signed those documents years ago, when the developers begged him for a slice of his acreage to build their precious subdivision. At the time, Marcus had thought it was a fair trade. Let them have their cul-de-sacs and white picket fences, their manicured lawns and bylaws, while he kept his ranch and the wide open spaces that came with it. But the contracts had been written on his terms, and buried in the language was a clause that the HOA had either never read or foolishly assumed. He'd never enforced the clause that gave him the right to adjust the rent for the land they occupied with only 30 days' notice, and under extraordinary circumstances, immediately. The arrogance of their letter was just the extraordinary circumstance he needed. Marcus sat at his desk beneath the yellow glow of the lamp, the house quiet except for the ticking clock, and began drafting notices of his own. He wasn't vindictive in his tone. He didn't need to be. His words were measured, professional, and devastating. Effective immediately, the notices read, "The rent for the leased parcels will increase by a factor of 3. Failure to comply will result in termination of lease agreements and forfeiture of property rights under the terms outlined in Section 8, Clause C." He typed each letter with meticulous care, signed them in ink, and sealed them in crisp white envelopes. By the time he was done, the pile of letters sat on his desk like a stack of verdicts waiting to be handed down. The next morning he delivered them by certified mail and, for good measure, dropped copies directly into the HOA's meeting box. He didn't need to see their faces to imagine the chaos that would erupt when the board read them.
How the people
Who thought they had 3 days to strip him of his home would now spend those same 3 days scrambling to figure out how they could possibly pay triple the rent for the very ground beneath their feet. And Marcus didn't stop there. He called his attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had helped him draft the contracts all those years ago, and asked her to be ready for the inevitable pushback. She laughed when she heard the story, not out of humor, but out of disbelief at the HOA's stupidity. Promised she would have her phone on at all times for when they came crawling with their threats. It didn't take long. By the second day, whispers rippled through the neighborhood, carried by neighbors who had overheard board members shouting behind closed doors, their voices rising in panic as they realized the numbers didn't add up. Fines and threats suddenly seemed laughable when they faced the reality of Marcus's new rent. The HOA's entire budget, which had been comfortably padded by predictable costs and fees, was now a sinking ship taking on water faster than they could bail. Emergency meetings were called, and Marcus received 3 phone calls from board members' calls he didn't answer. He wanted them to stew, to feel the weight of the imbalance they had created, to understand fully that the man they had tried to push out held their future in the palm of his hand. On the 3rd day, just as their arrogant deadline was set to expire, Marcus walked into the community center where the HOA had gathered for yet another emergency session. He didn't storm in or raise his voice. He simply walked to the front of the room, laid their 72-hour notice on the table beside his own rent adjustment letter, and stood silently until the murmurs died down. When he finally spoke, his words were calm, steady, and undeniable. Gave me 72 hours to sell my home.
Atch.
Gave you 72 hours to face reality. If you can't respect me as your neighbor, you'll respect me as your landlord. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the sound of someone clearing their throat. The board members who had written their notice with smug confidence just days earlier now sat pale and deflated, their authority reduced to rubble. One of them, a woman who had once fined him for leaving his tractor parked in the drive, leaned forward with pleading eyes and asked if there was any way to work something out. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat, simply reminded them that he had followed every letter of the law, that the contracts were clear, that if they wished to negotiate, they could do so respectfully and on his terms. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted so completely that it was almost painful to watch. The people who had strutted around with clipboards and petty fines were now scrambling to protect their own homes from the consequences of their arrogance. Marcus gathered his papers, nodded once, and left them to their panic. By the time he walked back to his ranch, the sun was setting over his pastures, casting everything in a warm, golden light. His wife was waiting on the porch, and when he handed her the crumpled 72-hour notice, they both laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer relief that the balance had been restored. For Marcus, it wasn't just about the money or the contracts. It was about respect. He'd been told he didn't belong, that his way of life was a problem to be eliminated. But in the end, he proved that no piece of paper from a petty HOA could erase the sweat and sacrifice he had poured into his land. Justice, he realized, doesn't always come in the form of raised voices or drawn-out battles. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a clause in a contract, waiting like a seed until the perfect moment to grow into something unstoppable. And as the lights flickered on across the subdivision lights, powered by leases that now cost 3 times as much, Marcus sipped his coffee, looked out at his land, and knew with absolute certainty that he had not only defended his home, but had turned the tables so completely that the HOA would never dare test him again.